The Silent Harvest, Understanding the Holodomor. The Holodomor, a term derived from the Ukrainian words for hunger, holod, and extermination, mor, stands as one of the most devastating man-made catastrophes of the 20th century. Between 1932 and 1933, millions of Ukrainians perished in a catastrophic famine orchestrated by the Soviet government under Joseph Stalin. Unlike natural famines caused by drought or crop failure, this mass starvation was the direct result of deliberate political and economic policies designed to subjugate the Ukrainian populace. It represents a lethal intersection of radical communist ideology, economic mismanagement, and a calculated attempt to crush the spirit of a historically independent-minded nation. The origins of this famine trace back to Joseph Stalin's radical restructuring of the Soviet economy through the First Five-Year Plan, initiated in the late 1920s. The Soviet leadership sought to rapidly transform the USSR from an agrarian society into a heavily industrialized military power. To finance this massive industrialization, the state needed to extract maximum grain and agricultural produce from the countryside to feed the growing urban workforce and to export abroad for foreign currency. Ukraine, historically known as the breadbasket of Europe, due to its incredibly fertile black soil, became the primary target for this aggressive resource extraction. The machinery of famine central to Stalin's plan was the policy of forced collectivization, which required peasants to surrender their privately owned land, livestock, and farming equipment to massive state-run collective farms, kolkhozes. For the Ukrainian peasantry, who possessed a deeply ingrained tradition of individual land ownership and community autonomy, collectivization was viewed as a return to serfdom. Resistance was fierce and widespread. Many farmers chose to slaughter their livestock and burn their crops rather than hand them over to the Soviet state. To crush this resistance, the Soviet regime launched a brutal campaign of dekulakization, targeting the most successful and efficient farmers, who were labeled as kulaks or class enemies. Hundreds of thousands of these skilled agricultural workers were stripped of their property, arrested, executed, or deported to remote labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia. By systematically eliminating the most experienced farmers, the Soviet state effectively decapitated the agricultural sector, guaranteeing a drastic drop in future crop yields. As agricultural output inevitably plummeted due to the chaos of collectivization and the removal of skilled farmers, the Soviet government refused to adjust its expectations. Instead, it imposed impossibly high grain procurement quotas on Ukraine. When collective farms inevitably failed to meet these unrealistic targets, the state confiscated all available food reserves, including seed grain intended for the next year's planting. The Kremlin treated the inability to meet quotas not as an agricultural failure, but as an act of deliberate sabotage and anti-Soviet rebellion. The draconian nature of this procurement was legally enshrined in August 1932 with a decree colloquially known as the Law of 5 Years of Corn. This chilling legislation stipulated that the theft of even a microscopic amount of socialist property, such as a starving child gleaning a handful of grain from a harvested field, was punishable by 10 years in the Gulag or death by execution. By criminalizing the most basic acts of survival, the state ensured that the food grown on Ukrainian soil was entirely inaccessible to the people who harvested it. Enforcing starvation and suppressing identity. To enforce these merciless quotas, the Soviet state dispatched tens of thousands of loyalist activists and secret police into the Ukrainian countryside. These requisition brigades utilized brutal tactics, using long metal rods to probe the earth for hidden caches of food. They did not simply confiscate grain. They systematically stripped peasant households of all edible goods, including vegetables, fruit, and livestock. Entire villages that failed to meet quotas were placed on blacklists, subjecting them to a complete economic blockade where no goods could enter, ensuring total starvation. To prevent a mass exodus of starving peasants seeking food, the regime implemented a rigid system of internal passports and border controls in late 1932. While urban factory workers were permitted to move, peasants were denied passports, effectively trapping them in their dying villages. Armed guards and military cordons were stationed at railway stations and along the borders of the Ukrainian Republic, violently turning back those desperate enough to try to escape to neighboring regions where food was more plentiful. The Ukrainian countryside was transformed into a vast, open-air death camp. Crucially, the Holodomor was not solely an economic disaster, but rather a calculated component of a broader assault on Ukrainian national identity. Concurrent with the famine, Stalin ordered a severe purge of the Ukrainian intelligentsia, political leadership, writers, and clergy. By simultaneously starving the peasantry, the traditional keepers of Ukrainian language and cultural heritage, and executing the nation's intellectual elite, the Kremlin sought to permanently eradicate any prospect of Ukrainian independence or organized resistance to Soviet homogenization. The human cost and the veil of silence. The physical and psychological toll of these combined policies was apocalyptic. During the height of the famine in the spring of 1933, it is estimated that roughly 28,000 Ukrainians were dying every single day. The landscape was marked by mass graves and an eerie silence, as even the wildlife and domestic pets had been consumed by the starving populace. The social fabric of rural Ukraine completely collapsed, with widespread reports of madness and, in the most desperate cases, cannibalism, as individuals were pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Despite the staggering scale of the dying, the Soviet Union orchestrated a highly effective international campaign of denial and disinformation. Western journalists, most notoriously Walter Duranty of the New York Times, aided this cover-up by parroting Soviet talking points and dismissing reports of mass starvation as anti-communist propaganda. However, courageous individuals like Welsh journalist Gareth Jones risked their lives to travel through the affected regions, eventually breaking the story to the Western world, though their truthful accounts were largely ignored or suppressed at the time. The question of genocide and historical memory. The targeted, deliberate nature of these policies lies at the center of the ongoing discourse regarding whether the Holodomor constitutes genocide. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish legal scholar who coined the term genocide and heavily influenced the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, explicitly described the Holodomor as a classic example of a Soviet genocide against the Ukrainian nation. He argued that it was not just a case of mass murder, but a multi-pronged strategy aimed at the destruction of the Ukrainian national pattern. While critics of the genocide classification often point out that famine also struck other regions of the Soviet Union, such as the Volga region and Kazakhstan, historians emphasize the unique dimensions of the Ukrainian experience. The closing of Ukraine's borders, the specific targeting of Ukrainian cultural leaders, and the use of the blacklisting system were punitive measures uniquely concentrated on Ukraine and the ethnically Ukrainian Kuban region. These factors demonstrate an intent to destroy the Ukrainian nation in part, aligning with the legal definition of genocide. For decades following the tragedy, the Holodomor was heavily censored within the Soviet Union. Merely mentioning the famine could result in imprisonment. It was not until the Soviet Union's collapse and the subsequent opening of classified state archives in the 1990s that the undeniable documentary evidence of the Kremlin's directives was brought to light. Today, Ukraine and over 30 other countries officially recognize the Holodomor as an act of genocide, a vital step in acknowledging the suffering of the millions who perished. Today, the Holodomor remains a cornerstone of modern Ukrainian historical memory and a poignant lesson in the dangers of totalitarianism. The intergenerational trauma of the famine deeply informs Ukraine's contemporary fierce defense of its sovereignty and deep-seated distrust of centralized Russian authority. By remembering the Holodomor, the international community not only honors the millions of silenced victims, but also reaffirms the critical importance of historical truth and the ongoing global commitment to human rights.